Good day, friends. Welcome to session 11 of Christians in Chaos. Let's grab those Bibles and here we go. Now, just a reminder, throughout this letter, Paul is addressing 6 questions that the church is either specifically asking him about or that he's heard about through the grapevine, okay? So this week we are covering 2 of those. The first one, the issue of veil wearing, you're going to cover in your daily devotionals. The issue that we're covering today has to do with the second half of chapter 11, and it concerns the way that the Corinthian Christian church is celebrating the Lord's Supper, aka communion, aka the Eucharist, or if you grew up in some denominations, you know it as that little bitty cup of grape juice and that little bitty piece of cracker. Now, get ready, because Paul is gonna get a little snarky, okay? So let's read starting at verse 17. In the following directives, I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good. Dude, this is not gonna be a cheerful part of this letter. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it. Now again, this is hearsay. Paul says, I have heard what you have been doing. They have been telling me what it's like when you are meeting together, when you're worshiping and when you're fellowshipping together, and there are divisions among you. Now, we already know this. This came up in chapter 1. Remember, they're divided on the leaders that are their favorites. They're divided on some theological issues, okay? However, the situation that we have here is a very literal, visual division. If we were a fly on the wall in the Corinthian church, it seems like one of the words we would use to describe them is cliquish. They were cliquey. And it seems this was very apparent every time that they got together, specifically when they would celebrate the Lord's Supper. Now, verse 19 says, no doubt, there have to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval. Now, there's a good chance this is sarcasm. Paul is like, oh yes, you should definitely attempt to earn God's approval by who you sit with, because obviously God cares about who the popular crowd is at the table. And then he goes on, verses 20 through 22. So then, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat. For when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not in this matter. I mean, Paul is like throwing up his hands. Like, I don't even know what to do with you on this issue. He is disgusted by this behavior. Now, let me give you a little more background here. If you recall, when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, it wasn't a supper, right? Like, it's a bite. It's a little sip. But they were at a dinner when it occurred, right? They were in the midst of their Passover meal. So it would seem right in following that tradition that the Corinthian Christians were like, hey, we're supposed to celebrate this Lord's Supper of remembrance. Why don't we just tie it in with dinner and we'll do it at the end? And they even named it. It was called the Agape Feast. Agape is one of the Greek words for love. Now, if you heard that churches, perhaps in the 70s, were having events called love feasts, you might think it's a bit sketchy, okay? But a traditional love feast in the first century was meant to be a meal celebrated together where each member brought what he or she was able to share with the group. Guys, this is the first potluck. If you ever needed a biblical reason to have a potluck, 1 Corinthians 11 is your jam, okay? So the tradition began that as part of these love feasts, these potluck meals, towards the end, the whole church would celebrate the Lord's Supper together. But here seemed to be the issue. So they were usually in a house. A lot of times it would be a larger house. It would be one of the more affluent members of the church they would host, okay? So you're in this larger house. It may have many rooms. You have a big group of people. You can't all fit in the dining room, right? Like, what do you do at Thanksgiving? You overflow, right? You have some people sitting in the kitchen. You have some people in this room. You pull out some chairs at the couch, Well, it seems this was happening in the early church as well. They weren't all sitting together. They were kind of spread out. Well, in our human nature, what do? We sit with people that we're comfortable with. And we've all been known to do this at church, right? I mean, we gravitate to the people who are similar to us. Maybe people that we're already friends with, that we have a lot in common with. I mean, can we just admit that there's still parts of life, even as an adult, that feel like a high school lunchroom? In my high school, everybody sat at their specific tables. You had the popular crowd, you had the skaters that wore like JNCOs, if you remember JNCOs, okay? Then you had like the drama club, and you had the band, and they all sat with each other, and it was a very divided room. Obviously, the Church of Corinth wasn't divided in that way, but it sounds like they had those tables of probably people that were Jewish, people that were Gentiles, people that wore veils, as we're going to see, people that didn't, maybe people of certain socioeconomic classes. It appears that the rich were sitting together, the poor were sitting together. Now, it's important to mention as well, in the Corinthian culture, having banquets to honor pagan gods was a thing. And those banquets usually involved a lot of alcohol and a lot of poor decisions. They were wild parties. That's what the Corinthian culture did. So it seems that mindset may have overflowed to the way that the Corinthian church is hosting their parties and fellowship times as well. So you have your very visual cliques, divisions within this body during their fellowshipping time. And people are bringing food from their homes. Some people are able to bring a lot of food. Some poorer people in the congregation aren't able to bring a lot of food at all. It's also BYOB. So many members seem to be bringing a lot of wine to the party. This has just become one big wild thing. And Paul is like, this cannot be the way it is. You cannot do this. When Jesus instituted these sacred moments of remembrance, the disciples weren't drunk, hanging from a chandelier, okay? They weren't sitting at all these different tables. They were together. They were unified. And remember, the disciples were so different from each other. You had so many different personalities that Jesus had called together in that room. They had different experiences. They had different socioeconomic classes. And yet those disciples in the midst of Jesus came together that night, unified. And apparently what's happening too is Paul's like, not only is that happening, wild parties, divisions, cliques, but some of you, it is reported to me, are eating so much that by the end of the meal, when it's time to remember and do the Lord's Supper together, there's not even enough bread and wine left for the less popular congregants to participate. So people in your congregation are being left out of communion. You are so focused on yourselves. Now, as Paul does with so many issues in his letters to them, he is saying you can't treat this sacred part of your meal casually. You can't have been drinking for hours on end, being gluttonous with all this kind of food, and then you come to the part where you're remembering the atoning sacrifice of Jesus and his blood, and you go, oh yeah, give me one of those. Let me drink that too. Let me throw some of that bread in my mouth. No, this is sacred. This is Christ's blood poured out for you. This is Christ's body broken for you. It is a sacred moment of remembrance. We are not to cheapen that moment. Paul then goes on to remind them of the true purpose, the true meaning behind celebrating the night that Jesus was betrayed. And this is what he says in verse 27. So then, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. Now, the unworthy manner that Paul is talking about here is taking the Lord's Supper while also rejecting other people in your midst, thinking yourself more holy than others, more deserving, more popular than others. thinking that you have God's approval over and above somebody else in the congregation. They were taking it without truly appreciating the sacrifice of Jesus. And it was their partiality and their favoritism and their prejudice that Paul is wildly against, because the Lord's Supper is meant to be a sacred, unifying element for us all. This is what Paul leaves them with in verse 33. He says, "So then, my brothers and sisters, when you gather to eat, you should all eat together. Anyone who is hungry should eat something at home, so that when you meet together, it may not result in judgment." Eat together. Paul is like, listen, y'all need to figure it out. You are not a bunch of churches in one house. You are one church in one house. You may need to cram everybody into that dining room to take the Lord's Supper. You may need to knock down a wall. I don't know what you need to do, but you need to figure it out. Because when it comes to worship, you worship together. You be together. You are the family of God. And none of this house party stuff, Paul says. He's like, you want to do that? Eat before you get there. Paul's like, maybe y'all just need to forego your meal. Maybe you need to cut that part out of it. You just need to eat at your homes before you get there and appreciate the sacrificial institution of that Lord's Supper. This is his body. This is his blood poured out for you, the new covenant, the fulfillment of everything that they have been waiting for. Figure it out, he says. Come together with the mindset of worship and of remembrance and of unity. Now, this is how Paul ends it. He says, and when I come, I will give further directions. He is not done talking about that. I wish we had that part. All right, friends, enjoy your daily devotions through the chapter this week. Next week, we're going to be covering chapters 12 and chapters 13 because they really go together so incredibly well. In all that you do this week, may we seek to love each other well. No prejudices, no divisions, no cliques. May we get out of our comfort zone and go after the people in our body, in our congregations as believers, and uphold them and respect them and esteem them as those equally loved by God. Jesus Christ poured out his blood for all people, all kinds of people. In whatever we do this week, may we preach with our actions, with our words, with who we are. May we preach that kind of love. I will see you next week, friends, for Christians in Chaos, Session 12.